In chapter 8, we move from defeat to victory. So, what changed? Joshua now asks God for guidance, and God gave him a battle plan. Verse 1. Now the Lord said to Joshua, do not fear or be dismayed. Take all the people of war with you and arise, go up to Ai. See, I have given into your hand the king of Ai, his people, his city, and his land. You shall do to Ai and its king just as you did to Jericho and its king. You shall take only its spoil and its cattle as plunder for yourselves. Set an ambush for the city behind it. Now, as you see in my notes here, Ai is Hebrew ha'ai. Ai apparently only has one syllable, not two as we tend to use. Thus, it was pronounced ha'ai. Now, I used that in reading these verses, and it may have sounded a bit confusing to you, and it certainly sounds confusing to me because Ai, the word, and I, our English word for self, are the same pronunciation. So I don't care if it's pronounced ha'ai, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to say Ai just so that we Americans don't get all befuddled by this. Now, we see here the Lord reassures Joshua not to worry in light of his sense of failure in the first attack on Ai. The Lord tells Joshua this phrase, all the people of war. That was the Israelite army he is referring to. Now, the Israelite army numbered over 600,000 during the time of wandering, as we see in Numbers chapters 1 and 2. But those men died out during that time because they refused to enter the Promised Land, but were largely replaced by those under the age of 20 at that time. So that means someone at 19 at that time would now be 59 to 60 after the 40 years. Plus those who had been born during that time of wandering are now available, the men. And so the army still has several 100,000 men who can be called on to serve at this time in Israel's history. We know from verse 25 that all the people manning the Ai garrison were about 12,000. Now, it would have been less than that in numbers of soldiers. There are some women and children there, but they don't count as warriors. Now, king of Ai, the word actually is Melech, which means a military commander, a general, or something like that. This, like Jericho, was a fortress guarding Canaan from attack by outsiders, such as the Egyptians and invaders from the east. Jericho was made Kiram, meaning that it was devoted to complete destruction as a thing accursed of God. Jericho completely belonged to God. And this is what we learned from Barry last week was meant as part of the ban. Now, so the Israelites were not allowed to take anything from Jericho. Ai is a bit different. The Israelites were allowed to take the material spoil and the livestock, but they still were to kill all the inhabitants. So something's different. So then the question can come up, why was Achan executed for doing this at Jericho? If he had done that at Ai, he wouldn't have been executed. So what's going on? Jericho and Ai are examples of the principle of first fruits, or as some call it, firstlings. Captures everything, the concept of everything better than first fruits. It's not just agriculture. That the first of everything belongs to God. Jericho was the first step in the conquest of Canaan, and so everything in it belonged to God. After that, the Israelites could take some of the spoil for themselves. Let's look at this a little closer. Spoil in cattle. That's material goods and livestock, the things that they were told not to take from Jericho. At Jericho, everything was to go to the Lord, and this was a picture of the concept of first fruits. And first fruits refer to much more than agricultural produce. It includes everything made by the Israelites and their firstborn, and made by them, and also their firstborn children as well. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, this is Leviticus 23, saying, Speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, when you enter the land which I'm going to give you and reap its harvest, then you shall bring in the sheaf of the firstfruits of your harvest to the priest. Okay, we also see here that God now is instructing Joshua how to set up the plan of attack. He says you're to use an ambush. So who's now in charge of this attack? It's God. Verse 3. So Joshua arose with all the people of war to go up to Ai. And Joshua chose 30,000 men, valiant warriors, and sent them out at night. He commanded them, saying, See, you're going to ambush the city from behind it. Do not go very far from the city, but all of you be ready. Then I and all the people who are with me will approach the city. And when they come out to meet us as at the first, we will flee before them. They will come out after us until we have drawn them away from the city. For they will say, they're fleeing before us as at the first. So we will flee before them. And you shall rise from your ambush and take possession of the city, for the Lord your God will deliver it into your hand. So from the whole army, Joshua chose 30,000 men to take up positions at night to set up an ambush. Now, the size of the army. The census counts listed in Numbers chapters 1 and 2 and 26 depend on what the Hebrew word eleph means. Most scholars have assumed that it means 1,000, but the better translation is that it means a troop. All right, so what constitutes a troop in those days? There's a great deal of disagreement over what eleph means, and I'm not qualified to judge. I don't know enough about all this answer, and it gets into Hebrew and all, and it left me in the dust as I was trying to read about it. But the overall sense I got is it probably means something less than 1,000. The idea that Israelites had an army of 600,000 would make them, according to history and archaeology, the biggest army in the world on the planet at that time. So probably eleph, though it doesn't mean 10 or 20 or 30, it's something ridiculous like some of the skeptics argue, it's probably less than 1,000. You know, our American Army that I was in, you start with a guy and then you have squads, group of 8 to 10, depending on what they're all about. Platoons are made of squads, companies are made of platoons, battalions are made up of companies, brigades are made up of battalions, and divisions are made up of battalions and brigades. Multiple divisions make up an army, and if you have several armies, like in World War II, you would have a theater, like the European or Pacific theaters. So we're not sure, so maybe not 600,000, but still, compared, relatively speaking, to the other peoples and their armies of that day, they had a big army. I think that's the point we want to get here. Now, the battle plan here, the rest of the army is going to approach Ai from the north. They're going to be camped out on the north side of Ai, where they're apparently the gate to their fortress is. And so they're going to advance down to draw their warriors out of the forest, to make them come out. And that's what happened earlier, and Israelites were beaten. When Ai's troops charge out to take on the Israelites, and Joshua's forces are going to draw back, and that's going to cause these Ai troops to come further and further and further out away from their fortress. And then once they're well out, the ambushers will charge in and take it. So let's look at a map here. Oh yes, we always have to have a map in this class. So you'll see Jericho sort of down to the left, and you have Ai kind of the upper left center area, and then Bethel circled north of it. Now, more recent research has found perhaps a better prospective site for where Ai was. And that's, if you look at just below Ai, you see the word Deir, or I don't know how to pronounce that. The new site that better fits the geography described in this chapter would be right about where the letter D of Deir is. So it can give us a sense of where it is. Notice it's not very far. It's really kind of on the other side of a valley, maybe a mile or so. Remember, we're dealing with Israel, which is a small country, and these distances, it's not like looking at a U.S. map where that distance from Ai to the letter D could be 20 miles or so. No, we're talking maybe a mile or so, very short, and maybe 2.5 miles between Ai and Bethel. Bethel's going to get mentioned in this chapter as well. Verse 8, then it will be when you have seized the city that you shall set the city on fire. You shall do it according to the word of the Lord. See, I've commanded you. So Joshua sent them away, and they went to the place of ambush and remained between Bethel and Ai. On the west side of Ai, it's where they set up, but Joshua spent that night among the people. Okay, we're seeing more of this battle plan. The ambushers set up between Ai and Bethel on the northwest side of Ai, as you can see from that map. So, and they're not too far apart. We see here that these two garrisons had an agreement to come to the defense of each other if attacked, which is why God had instructed Joshua to use an ambush. They could not allow the forces from Bethel to charge in and interfere with the attack. Now, it's my suspicion that Joshua probably didn't know about this agreement until God revealed it to him and telling him that you need to set up an ambush on that side. It also put the ambush forces right between Bethel and Ai. We're also going to learn as we go forward that there were troops of Bethel already in this garrison of Ai. Now, fortresses like Jericho and Ai and some of the others we're going to hear about in upcoming chapters were often attacked by the Egyptians. And so they were built to fend off these attacks. The Egyptians repeatedly attacked people groups who dwelt in the Jordan Valley. That's on flat ground. But the Canaanites were able to stop their advances into the hill country. Now, the Egyptians, more than anybody else at that time, relied heavily on their version of armored vehicles, which was chariots. And when the enemy would find a chariot pulled by an 800-pound horse and iron wheels come roaring at them at horse racing speed, and multiple chariots that would blast through the lines and just totally disorient the front lines of the defenders. And then the chariots turn around from behind, they come back, and they attack from behind while the Egyptian foot soldiers are now engaging the now disrupted and disorganized defenders, the forces, who are foot soldiers as well. And that way, the Egyptians were very powerful and maintained control of that whole valley, because that was one of the major trade routes that led up to the north, up over what we know as modern Syria, and then on around to the east and southeast back to Babylon. And so it was important to keep this area free and under the ownership of the Egyptians. But think of it for a minute. You have a force that was relying on chariots, armor of their day. And they're going to go up into the rugged, rocky, hilly country of the middle section there where the Canaanites lived and where the Israelites were moving up into. Chariots would be completely useless at that point. So the Egyptians were repeatedly repulsed in their efforts to get up into the hill country. Okay, that's a little what's going on here and why are they doing what they're doing and why are these forts where they are. Okay, while the ambushers are in the fort, they're supposed to set it on fire to signal the rest of the Israelite army that is now pretending to retreat from the attacking Ai troops. And that signals them to turn around and then charge the advancing Ai troops. Verse 10, Now Joshua rose early in the morning and mustered the people, and he went up with the elders of Israel before the people to Ai. Then all the people of war who were with him went up and drew near and arrived in front of the city and camped on the north side of Ai. Now there was a valley between him and Ai, and he took, or had taken, about 5,000 men and set them in ambush between Bethel and Ai on the west side of the city. So they stationed the people, all the army that was on the north side of the city, and its rear guard on the west side of the city, and Joshua spent that night in the midst of the valley. Okay, so who did what and where? Let's look at this battle plan in more detail. Joshua readies his troops, and he has the leaders of the 12 tribes go with him in front of the army to camp on the north side of the fortress, which was where the gate was. Now, we learned that a small valley about 30 to 40 foot below the hillsides was between the Israelite forces and Ai. So don't think of this valley the way we think of the hollows here that are deep and narrow. This was a shallow valley, maybe from the hillside down to the base was 30 to 40 foot drop. Not much, but obviously enough to give some difference in elevation. So, but we want to have a correct understanding of this. Now, the phrase rose up early in the morning, we see that so often in Old Testament. What it really means is, sure, they got up in the morning. Okay, that's not the point. Is that they got up ready to go. This meant stepping forward into action. Now, we see here 5,000 troops were assigned to the ambush. It's possible that 30,000 may have gone up at first, but then once the ambuscade was established, Joshua realizes we don't need 30,000 up there. And so all but the 5,000 returned to the main force. That's, some commentators argue for that. However, and I'm not an expert here, those who know Hebrew say the structure of the language here argues against this view, and also that there were 2 ambush sites. Some argue there were 2, but apparently it doesn't support that. It looks like that in some translations into English and such, but that's not the way it is in Hebrew. This ambuscade was used to prevent troops, again, as we were talking earlier, from Bethel coming to the aid of Ai. Now we have here verse 3 that we read earlier is a general description of the plan, while here we're seeing some more detailed descriptions of this battle plan. And settling the forces across the valley from Ai, it took some time. Anybody who's been in the military knows you don't move thousands of people in 15 minutes. It takes some time to set them up and so forth. So they're there at night. Now, it's interesting, as we'll see coming along in verse 14, that the Ai watchmen on the fortress wall apparently didn't notice all this going on. And another thing I want to mention here involving the skeptics' attacks on just about all of Joshua. They hate this book, sort of like they hate the Gospel of John. But what we have here is so many details that it strongly argues that the writer here was an eyewitness. And I do believe that it was Joshua Now, he may not have literally always wrote it himself. More likely, as a commander and leader, he dictated it. But this shows that, yes, this was written by somebody who really was there and knew the details, knew there was a little valley, knew that the gate entrance was on the north side, and knew that Ai and Bethel worked together, and so you had to stop them, and other details like this. It wasn't made up hundreds of years later. Verse 14, it came about when the king of Ai saw it. Notice, it's now the morning. When they notice, ooh, a bunch of Israelites down there across the valley. Okay, that the men of the city hurried and rose up early and went out to meet Israel in battle. They got outside of their garrison. That's important. He and all his people at the appointed place before the desert plain. But he did not know that there was an ambush against him behind the city. Joshua and all Israel pretended to be beaten before them and fled by the way of the wilderness. And all the people who were in the city were called together to pursue them. And they pursued Joshua and were drawn away from the city. So not a man was left in Ai or Bethel who had not gone out after Israel. And they left the city unguarded and pursued Israel. Oh boy. Okay. The next morning we see the men of Ai on the walls as the sunrise is coming and beginning to get enough light to see by. They notice, whoa, there's a whole bunch of thousands of Israelites all parked just up to the north of us out in front of the city gate, maybe half a mile or so away. And so they, of course, obviously alert their commander. And it's interesting, their method of attack. They go out to attack as they had done before. They had probably discovered that Egyptians coming up were not trained in how to do battle on uneven ground. And so, okay, the Israelis, we know they came up from Egypt. And so maybe they're like the Egyptians and we can beat them back just as we did the Egyptians. All right. Now, Joshua's troops retreat again, just like they had talked about. And so the commander directs all of his troops to chase out after them. This left the fort unguarded. That was a bad military decision on the part of that commander. Might have been influenced by the Lord. In verse 17, we see that soldiers from Bethel had been in Ai to render assistance, probably once Jericho fell. And they could see then, as Barry told us last week, that the Israelites were moving west-northwest beyond Jericho, kind of in a northwest angle, that it was approaching Bethel and Ai. They had decided to do that. And so they were already there, as we find out. But they get killed right along with all the people of Ai. Now, it doesn't say, though, that Bethel itself had been attacked. Verse 18, then the Lord said to Joshua, stretch out the javelin that is in your hand toward Ai, for I will give it into your hand. So Joshua stretched out the javelin that was in his hand toward the city. The men in ambush rose quickly from their place, and when he had stretched out his hand, they ran and entered the city and captured it, and they quickly set the city on fire. When the men of Ai turned back and looked, behold, the smoke of the city ascended to the sky, and they had no place to flee, this way or that, for the people who had been fleeing to the wilderness turned against the pursuers. When Joshua and all Israel saw that the men in ambush had captured the city, and that the smoke of the city ascended, they turned back and slew the men of Ai. The others came out from the city to encounter them, so that they were trapped in the midst of Israel, some on this side and some on that side, and they slew them until no one was left of those who survived or escaped. But they took alive the king of Ai and brought him to Joshua. Okay, We see here that Joshua uses his javelin as a signal. Now, we don't know if he tied a banner to it or something, but the distances here were close enough that the ambushers were able to see his signal and to know when to charge into the fort. Okay, so the fort is quickly taken and they burn it up. The men of Ai turn around, they see the smoke, and oh boy, they realize they're in a bad place. They can't go back and they can't go forward. For the men of Israel, the smoke is the signal to turn around and attack the pursuers. That's what they were watching for. As soon as they saw the smoke come up, Ai garrison has fallen. These troops now have nowhere to go. So Joshua's troops and the ambushers then together attack, and they wipe out everybody except their commander of Ai. Verse 24. Now when Israel had finished killing all the inhabitants of Ai in the field in the wilderness where they pursued them, and all of them were fallen by the edge of the sword until they were destroyed, then all Israel returned to Ai and struck it with the edge of the sword. All who fell that day, both men and women, were 12,000, all the people of Ai. For Joshua did not withdraw his hand with which he stretched out the javelin until he had utterly destroyed all the inhabitants of Ai. So we see here there are about 12,000. It mentions men and women. By the way, it doesn't mention children. When you have a military fort, you'll have a few women, perhaps the top commanders would have their wives there, maybe. The general troops would not, very likely. And so it wasn't a city or a town as we think of it. Now, I want to address an issue here that the Bible gets attacked a lot, especially the Old Testament, by skeptics and atheists. The argument is that these people in the garrisons, Jericho and Ai, were innocent. They hadn't done anything to the Israelites. However, the Canaanites were given over 430 years to repent of their sins and turn to the true God. Now, I use Genesis 15 and 16. We see here a comment by God. This was Abraham involved here. Then in the fourth generation, they will return here, for the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet complete. The term Amorite and Canaanite here are synonymous. So they had that many years to repent of their sins and turn to the true God. Now, why would they do that? Well, they had the witness of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who were basically friends with most of them at that time. Now, they had some issues with the Philistines, who were a different group than these other Canaanites. In the evidence of the parting of the Red Sea, that was pretty evident that the God of the Israelites was strong. The complete destruction of Og, king of Bashan, and Sihon, king of Heshbon, the stopping up of the Jordan, and the miraculous fall of Jericho, but they still refused to turn to the Lord, except for Rahab and her family at Jericho. They had all of that they watched. They saw the people, or their scouts did, as they watched these people wandering around in the wilderness to the south of them for nearly 40 years, and they noticed the pillar of cloud by day and the fire by night. That's pretty awesome. That they had plenty of time to see the power and the might of this God of the Israelites. They didn't turn. It's used today to protest that God is wrong to allow innocent people to be harmed and killed through human evil activity and or natural calamities. You know, God is good. He wouldn't let this stuff happen. That's the argument. And the short answer to this is that nobody is innocent before God. Romans 3:23 tells us, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. These people were not innocent before God. These battles that we see in Joshua here are the battles of God against the Canaanites. He allows the Israelites to participate and he uses them, but this is between God and the Canaanites. It's not just the Israelites and the Canaanites. Verse 27. Israel took only the cattle and the spoil of that city as plunder for themselves, according to the word of the Lord, which he had commanded Joshua. So Joshua burned Ai and made it a heap forever, a desolation until this day. He hanged the king of Ai on a tree until evening, and at sunset Joshua gave command, and they took his body down from the tree and threw it at the entrance of the city gate, and raised over it a great heap of stones that stands to this day. Now, what we have here, Ai has the name Tel Olam, a heap forever. Presumably, it's the modern Et Tel that most people refer to when they talk about Ai. But new archaeological discoveries nearby, it's a place called Kerbet El Makatir, fits the geographic description of Ai much better, with the hills, the valley, the wilderness to the side, which was actually a very rocky area, made it, your footholds there were kind of rough, trying to fight on a hill or a valley floor covered with rocks. That all fits that area better than the Et Tel area. So, and these are biblically oriented scholars who accept the biblical accounts as true. They don't approach them as skeptics do, with they're automatically wrong, and therefore they're going to prove it's wrong. And either way, whether it's either Et Tel or El Makatir, neither have been occupied since the time of Joshua. Now, this Melech, or commander of Ai, was executed and impaled on a tree or a big spike for all to see, and then taken down at sunset and buried under a pile of rubble, which was not a proper burial at all. They just piled a bunch of rocks over him. They didn't give him a proper burial. Verse 30. Then Joshua built an altar to the Lord, the God of Israel, in Mount Ebal, just as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded the sons of Israel, as it is written in the book of the law of Moses, an altar of uncut stones on which no man had wielded an iron tool. And they offered burnt offerings on it to the Lord, and sacrificed peace offerings. He wrote there on the stones a copy of the law of Moses, which he had written, in the presence of the sons of Israel. Okay, we see here that Joshua built an altar at Mount Ebal per the instructions given by Moses in Deuteronomy 11, and also in chapter 27. Again, there was to be no use of iron tools to prepare the stonework. Now, first, the question is, how did we get from Ai to Mount Ebal? There's no description of what they did and how they got there, because Ebal is not close to Ai. Now, we see here some interesting things. He also inscribed the law of Moses on these stones. Now, that wasn't Joshua. They had stonemasons who could do that. He, as a commander, he's doing this. We don't have the idea that Moses and Joshua and Joseph and others in the Old Testament were all doing the things that they are saying all by themselves. Okay, now that was a lot of writing, but it's exactly what is stated in Deuteronomy 27:8. You shall write on the stones all the words of this law very distinctly. Some have thought, well, maybe it was just the 10 Commandments, but that's not all the words of the law. So that was a lot of writing, and it didn't take place in an afternoon. What we see here is that God doesn't want mankind to have an excuse to claim credit for the Lord's work. Whenever he works through us to do his work, he gets the credit, but we get the blessing. Verse 33. All Israel with their elders and officers and their judges were standing on both sides of the ark before the Levitical priests who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord, the stranger as well as the native. Half of them stood in front of Mount Gerizim, and half of them in front of Mount Ebal, just as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had given command at first to bless the people of Israel. Okay, there's some question about when this move up to Mount Ebal occurred. Did it occur right after the conquest of Ai? Or did it occur later, when the Israelites had settled away from Gilgal? Now, second part there, Barry already answered for us last week. They were already past Jericho, as Barry told us regarding chapter 7. So this Gilgal then, in this place, is in question. Okay, this question can be solved by recognizing that there was more than just one Gilgal. Deuteronomy 11:30 shows that a Gilgal was known in Moses' day before anybody had gone into the Promised Land. This Gilgal was near Shiloh. It was between Shechem, about halfway roughly between Shechem and Jerusalem. The place named Gilgal between the Jordan and Jericho was far away. It was down in the Jordan Valley. And it was not a good place to live permanently. It was about 850 feet below sea level, near the Dead Sea. It's hot and dry. The Gilgal next to the terebinths of Moreh that Abraham knew, which is what Moses referred to, was on a ridge that looked out over the Jordan Valley to the east. This area is now named Gilgilia. It's still there. It's a small community nowadays. For me, the best explanation is that after Ai, the Israelites moved north to this Gilgal/Gilgilia, which was a more permanent place to live until the land was divided among the 9 tribes on the east side of Jordan. Okay, another map. So let's look at this. We see, I use Shiloh as a marker. As those of you familiar with wandering around in Google Maps, it always gives you a nice little, looks like a red balloon. And you'll notice center, lower center, Gilgal with a question mark. And that was referring to 2 Kings 2:4 and Nehemiah 12:29, but you could also write in there if you wanted to, the passage in Genesis and in Deuteronomy. So it was this Gilgal, which is Gilgilia, and if you look close, you can see it's in bottom, it's at the base or valley of runs basically northwest to southeast. It shows up there a little bit. You can kind of get an idea there. Now, this modern Gilgilia, which is Gilgal, is around 2,450 feet above sea level. That's over about 1,000 feet higher up. And anybody who knows, having gone into the mountains in the Appalachians or out west or anywhere else where there are serious mountains, that the higher up you go, the cooler it gets. And so they had moved from the hot and dry Gilgal to the nice and cool and pleasant upland Gilgal, and they were in a valley there. And so big difference in these Gilgals. Okay, the site where Mount Gerizim and Ebal is also known as Shechem. Those who've studied Genesis know that figures prominently in that book. Okay, this is where the law was read to the people. Now, if you look right about dead center, now you can see that the mountain to the south is Gerizim, and the one to the north of it, which has that little range of probably small trees or something, that dark mark there. This was taken on Google from about, I think, 30,000 feet up or so. I fly around over Israel all the time using Google Pro. By the way, you can look to up the valley a little bit. You see a little red dot, and it's not easy to see, but there's the word Nablus there. The modern city is called Nablus, which was the old city Shechem. So this is where this was done. The law was carved on stones, and we have the reading. You'll see there at the bottom middle between these two, they call them mountains. If you were there, you'd refer to them as hills like we have here in the Ozarks. They're both around say 2,700 feet, whereas the valley down where the people were was around maybe as much as 1,900 feet. So it was pretty tall. It was taller than ours here, maybe more like down in north central Arkansas, where we actually have what having lived in Colorado, I would call them mountains, low mountains. I have trouble calling anything in Missouri a mountain, but that's just my bias. Sorry. Spent too long time in Colorado where they have real mountains. But anyway, enough of that. This is the site. You can see that on the valley floor there, if Joshua and the priests were down near the middle of it, then they could arrange before, on the flat part, before Gerizim and Ebal, makes almost an amphitheater with the west and east side open. And that's where all of the proclamation was made and where this was done. But so I invite you, anybody can do it. Just put into Google Earth Pro, and it'll come up, and it'll show a little white box, and it asks you to read it. And then once you've read it, hit the little X in the upper right, and then go play around, and you can explore all over the planet and have some fun on a rainy afternoon. Verse 34. Then afterward he read all the words of the law, the blessing and the curse, according to all that is written in the book of the law. There was not a word of all that Moses had commanded which Joshua did not read before all the assembly of Israel, with the women and the little ones and the strangers who were living among them. Basically, everybody in Israel was there. Nobody was left behind anywhere. It says he read all the words of the law. That took a long time. And obviously, again, as a commander, Joshua didn't do this by himself. In fact, it was a priest who would be in charge of this, since that was part of their job description. Every member of this nation, except for those now who had stayed behind on the east side of Jordan, we got to add that, heard this reading of the law. And those who would then go back on the east side heard it because they were in this group here, because they had sworn to help them during the battles for the land. But when they went back, they would then share all that occurred to those who were staying back on the east side. And the sojourners, the strangers, they who were living among them also heard this. Now, I want to read this. This is Deuteronomy 11. It shall come about when the Lord your God brings you into the land where you are entering to possess it, that you shall place the blessing on Mount Gerizim and the curse on Mount Ebal. Are they not across the Jordan, west of the way toward the sunset, in the land of the Canaanites who live in the Arabah, opposite Gilgal, beside the oaks of Moreh? For you are about to cross the Jordan to go in to possess the land which the Lord your God is giving you, and you shall possess it and live in it. And you shall be careful to do all the statutes and the judgments which I am setting before you today. Summary. Many commentators and preachers and pastors have recognized that AI represents our carnal nature. When we depend on our own ability to do God's work, we're not going to succeed. That's the hay, wood, and stubble that we have in 1 Corinthians 3:11 through 15. However, if we let the Lord work through us, as Joshua did when he turned to God for guidance after wailing and moaning back in chapter 7, we'll have success for our service. And that means, is illustrated by the gold, silver, and precious stones in 1 Corinthians. What we really have here, and we're learning here what Joshua and them had to learn the hard way, is that our greatest enemy is ourselves. There isn't any devil made me do it. When we make choices that are not aligned with what God wants, the consequences are going to be negative. The Israelites moved to take Ai without asking God for guidance, and they failed. But when they followed his directions, they experienced success. Okay, in the summary, Ai represents our carnal nature. That's when we depend on our own ability, our own strengths to do God's work. And we're not going to succeed. 1 Corinthians 3 calls that hay, wood, and stubble. However, if we let the Lord work through us, as Joshua did when he turned to God for guidance, we'll have success, which in Corinthians there is described as gold, silver, precious stones. And both we and Joshua and the Israelites need to learn our greatest enemy is us. There's no devil made me do it. Okay, when we make choices that are not aligned with the will of God, the results are going to be negative. The Israelites moved to take Ai without asking God for guidance, and they failed. But when they followed God's directions, they experienced success. Joshua went in there and looked and thought, okay, we had great success. We did exactly what the Lord said to do with Jericho. Wonderful result for them. Then they moved to Ai. And I'm afraid they fell prey of that little disease that's even shown and expressed in some commercials. It's the I got this. I call it the I got this syndrome. When we fall into that mindset, we're going to experience failure. We see that something needs to be done, and I'm going to do this, and I'm going to fix this, whether it be in the church and some other action. We're doing it for the Lord. Don't be surprised when we fall flat on our face and it fails because we didn't go to the Lord. Now, I want to also read another of Paul's passages. This is in Romans 7. I find then the principle that evil is present in me, the one who wants to do good. For I joyfully concur with the law of God in the inner man. But I see a different law in the members of my body, waging war against the law of my mind, and making me a prisoner of the law of sin which is in my members. Wretched man that I am! Who will set me free from the body of this death? Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord. He will free him from the body of death. So then, on the one hand, I myself, with my mind, am serving the law of God, but on the other, with my flesh, the law of sin. He recognizes that he wants to do something and he fails at it, and he has things he knows he shouldn't be doing, and he ends up doing them. He gives no particulars. It doesn't need to. We all have our own. And this is true for us as well. It's true for Joshua and the Israelites. They failed to seek God's guidance, and they flopped. Now, the question here is, how are we doing with this? Are we still struggling with this? We need to look to the Lord for those decisions, things we make, things we decide, things we want to do. Lord, is it your will? And Lord, what would you have us to do? Or what would you have me to do? When we go astray and start deciding all for ourselves that, Lord, I got this. No. Lord says, no, you don't. Another point, God was justified to destroy the Canaanites because their wickedness had only magnified over the 430 years. That goes back from Abraham's time to Joshua's time. They had descended into gross sin and immorality, and God, through his foreknowledge, knew they would never change and would only lead Israel into the same sins. So he had to take action here. Now, also, Jericho and Ai can also represent the concept of first fruits, that the first of all produce, including firstborn children and tithes and offerings, belongs to God. God got everything from Jericho. He didn't share any of it with the Israelites, but he shared Ai with the Israelites by letting them keep the material goods. God took the people. Now, many today suggest that we follow that rule of first fruits by paying, for example, our tithes and offerings before we pay our bills, monthly or bi-monthly, however you do it. We have our bills for groceries, going shopping, and all these things. But before we do any of that, we pay our tithes and offerings to the Lord, and then we deal with the rest of it. That is in keeping with this law of first fruits. So next week is chapter 9. We'll have Dan as our instructor.